The moment the probate judge held up Grandpa Samuel's sealed envelope, my brother Ethan muttered, "That was supposed to disappear with him." Why did my father suddenly look terrified after months of acting certain I'd been erased from the family forever? And why had Grandpa ordered the envelope to be opened only after every beneficiary stood in the same courtroom? My mother whispered that I had never deserved to be here, but the judge ignored her. As the court clerk broke the seal, I realized this wasn't just about an inheritance. Whatever Grandpa had hidden inside threatened years of carefully protected family secrets. Before I tell you what happened, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If stories about truth, family, and quiet justice speak to you, consider subscribing so you won't miss what happened after that envelope was finally opened. 7 years before that courtroom hearing, if someone had told me my own family would eventually pretend I no longer existed, I would have laughed. Not because we were especially close, because I genuinely believed there was a line families didn't cross. My name is Magnolia Chen. I was 30 when all of this began. I worked as a senior corporate compliance investigator for one of the largest healthcare systems in central Ohio. My job wasn't glamorous. I didn't wear a badge or carry a gun. I spent my days reviewing financial records, interviewing employees, comparing timelines, and figuring out whether policies had been ignored or someone had quietly crossed legal boundaries. The work taught me one lesson that eventually changed my life. People almost never hide the truth perfectly. They usually leave behind patterns. Ironically, that was exactly what destroyed my family. Growing up, I had always been the dependable one. If my parents needed help understanding insurance paperwork, they called me. If Grandpa Samuel needed someone to explain a bank statement or organize tax documents, they called me. If Ethan forgot a birthday, missed a payment, or walked away from another business, everyone somehow expected me to smooth things over afterward. No one ever announced those expectations. They simply became part of our family culture. Ethan was 4 years older than I was. He wasn't lazy. That would have been easier to understand. He was charismatic, confident, the kind of person who could convince almost anyone that his next idea would finally be the one that worked. He had opened a landscaping company, then a home remodeling business, then a property maintenance company. Each venture started with excitement. Each one ended with debt. Every failure somehow became someone else's responsibility, usually Grandpa's. Grandpa Samuel never seemed angry about it. He would sigh, write another check, and say, "Everyone deserves another chance." I believed him. After all, it was his money, his choice. I never questioned that. I built my own career, paid off. My student loans, bought a modest townhouse outside Columbus, and lived comfortably without asking my parents for anything. That independence became strangely inconvenient for them. Whenever relatives praised my career, my mother Linda would smile politely before saying something like, "Magnolia has always been very practical." It sounded like a compliment. It never felt like one. If someone admired my promotion, my father David would quickly add, "But Ethan takes risks. That's how real wealth is created." The conversation always shifted back to my brother. Eventually, I stopped noticing, or maybe I simply became used to disappearing. Grandpa still invited me to lunch once every month. Usually, we met at the same family-owned diner he'd been visiting for decades. Nothing fancy. The waitress already knew both our orders. Turkey sandwich for him, chicken salad for me. He never talked much about money. Mostly, we discussed books, local politics, baseball, or the latest construction projects around Columbus. Those lunches became the one place where I never felt compared to anyone else. One afternoon, he casually mentioned that several of his older commercial buildings needed expensive maintenance. I asked a few routine questions. "Who's managing those properties now?" "Ethan's company. Grandpa answered. I nodded. Everything going smoothly? He shrugged. I suppose. That answer stayed with me, not because of what he said, because Grandpa Samuel had always been decisive. I suppose wasn't his normal response. A few weeks later, I visited one of his rental buildings to drop off medication he'd forgotten after lunch. The building looked older than I remembered. Paint peeled around several windows. The landscaping was neglected. One section of gutter hung loose near the entrance. A tenant walking inside laughed when she noticed me looking up. They've been promising to fix that since last winter. I smiled politely. I thought maintenance had already been scheduled. She shook her head. They tell us that every month. I didn't think much of it, not yet. Old buildings constantly needed repairs. Delayed maintenance wasn't unusual. Still, something quietly lodged itself in the back of my mind. The next Sunday, my parents hosted dinner. Everyone seemed unusually cheerful. Ethan spent nearly an hour describing how difficult commercial property management had become. Labor costs are ridiculous, he complained, while helping himself to another serving of roast chicken. Dad nodded sympathetically. Your grandfather's lucky to have someone willing to handle all those headaches. Ethan sighed dramatically. Honestly, some months I barely break even. Nobody questioned him. Nobody asked to see numbers. My mother reached over and squeezed his shoulder. We're proud of you. I listened without saying anything. Later that evening, Grandpa mentioned replacing the roof on one of those same buildings. Without thinking, I said, I stopped by there this week. It didn't look like any major work had started. The room became strangely quiet. Ethan looked at me before smiling. You were there for what? 5 minutes. About 10. You can't judge months of work from one visit. I'm not judging. I was just surprised. Dad folded his napkin carefully. Magnolia. His voice carried the warning I recognized from childhood. Not everything needs to become an investigation. I wasn't investigating. It sounded like it. Mom added softly, Your brother works very hard. I know he does. Then trust him. The conversation moved on, but something had changed. For the first time, asking an ordinary question had somehow become an accusation. After dinner, I helped wash dishes while Mom dried them. Without looking at me, she said quietly, You know your grandfather worries easily. I know. So maybe don't bring up every little concern. I wasn't trying to upset anyone. I know you weren't. She finally looked at me. But sometimes being right isn't as important as keeping peace. I drove home thinking about those words. Keeping peace. I'd heard that phrase my entire life. It usually meant one thing: stop asking questions. Over the next several months, I noticed other small changes. Family group texts suddenly became quieter. Then I discovered there was another family thread I wasn't part of. Holiday plans were finalized before anyone mentioned them to me. Sometimes they weren't mentioned at all. One Thanksgiving, I opened social media and saw photographs from my parents' dining room. Everyone was there. Even cousins who lived out of state. I hadn't known dinner was happening. I stared at the pictures longer than I should have. The comments underneath hurt more than the photographs themselves. So happy everyone made it. Perfect family. Wouldn't have been complete without all of you. I closed the app. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was my mother. Oh, honey, she said casually. We assumed you were busy. You never invited me. A brief silence followed. I thought Ethan told you. He didn't. I'm sorry. It was all last minute. The explanation sounded rehearsed. I wanted to believe it. Instead, I said, okay. That single word ended the conversation. The exclusions became more frequent after that. Birthday dinners, weekend cookouts, Sunday lunches. Sometimes I learned about them afterwards, sometimes not at all. When I asked, there was always a reasonable explanation. We forgot. It happened quickly. We didn't think you'd be interested. Each excuse sounded believable by itself. Together, they formed a pattern. One afternoon, nearly a year after that awkward Sunday dinner, Grandpa called unexpectedly. "Are you free tomorrow?" "I can make time." "Good." His voice sounded quieter than usual. "I'd like to have lunch." The next day, we sat in our usual booth. He barely touched his sandwich. Instead, he watched people walking past the restaurant window for nearly a minute. Finally, he turned toward me. "Maggie." He hadn't called me that since I was a little girl. "I need you to promise me something." I smiled gently. "What is it?" "No matter what happens." He paused long enough for me to notice that his hands were trembling slightly around his coffee mug. "Don't ever stop paying attention." I frowned. "Grandpa, what do you mean?" He looked directly into my eyes. "I think you're the only one who still does." I drove home from that lunch, replaying Grandpa Samuel's words over and over. "I think you're the only one who still does." At the time, I interpreted them as the quiet reflections of an aging man who had begun noticing the distance growing within his family. I had no idea he was talking about something far more specific. For the next several weeks, our monthly lunches became more frequent. Instead of meeting once a month, Grandpa called every Thursday. Sometimes we met for breakfast, sometimes coffee. Occasionally, I stopped by his apartment after work. None of those visits felt dramatic. There were no whispered conspiracies, no accusations, no emotional speeches. If anything, Grandpa seemed determined to avoid speaking badly about anyone. That made me trust him even more. One Saturday morning, he pointed toward 3 banker boxes stacked neatly beside his dining room table. "I've been putting this off for years." I looked at the labels: property records, tax documents, rental agreements, insurance. "I need these organized." "You could hire someone." "I could." He smiled. "But I trust you." I laughed. "That's because I'm free." "No." He shook his head gently. "It's because you'll tell me the truth, even if I don't like it." That sentence stayed with me. Most people think compliance work is about catching criminals. It isn't. Most of my job involves answering one simple question. Does the evidence support the story people are telling? I approached Grandpa's records exactly the same way. I wasn't auditing him. I wasn't investigating Ethan. I simply wanted everything organized. We spent the entire afternoon sorting documents by year. Grandpa sat across the table wearing reading glasses older than I was. Every now and then he'd stop to tell a story about buying one of the buildings. "This one almost bankrupted me in 1989. He laughed. "Worst investment I ever made." An hour later, he'd point at another folder. "That little warehouse paid for your father's college." Listening to him, I realized every property represented decades of sacrifice. They weren't just investments. They were pieces of his life. Late that afternoon, I noticed something unusual. Several invoices from Ethan's property management company appeared almost identical. Same formatting, same contractor, same categories: roof inspection, emergency plumbing, electrical maintenance, parking lot repair. None of that seemed strange. Commercial buildings require constant work. What caught my attention wasn't the services. It was the timing. 3 different buildings supposedly received emergency plumbing repairs on the exact same day. Another invoice listed major landscaping work in January. Ohio had been covered in snow that week. I checked the date twice. Still January. I didn't immediately assume anything improper. Accounting errors happen. Wrong dates get entered. Invoices are duplicated. Someone uploads the wrong document. Those mistakes occur every day, so I made a small note on a yellow sticky pad. Verify invoice dates, nothing more. Grandpa noticed. What did you find? Probably nothing. Tell me anyway. Some dates don't quite make sense. He leaned back quietly. I've wondered about that. You have, for a while. Why didn't you ask Ethan? I did. What did he say? He blamed software. That sounded plausible. I nodded. It could honestly be software. I know. Grandpa sighed. I just don't know anymore. Over the next month, we continued organizing paperwork. I built simple spreadsheets showing rental income maintenance expenses, insurance costs, and property taxes. Nothing sophisticated. Just enough to let Grandpa see everything clearly. One afternoon, he stared at the spreadsheet for almost 5 minutes without saying a word. Finally, he tapped one column. Maintenance costs have nearly doubled. They have. But occupancy hasn't changed. No. And rental income is slightly lower. Correct. He frowned. Does that seem normal? It depends. On what? I turned my laptop toward him. If several buildings required major repairs at the same time, yes. If they didn't, then I'd probably ask more questions. He looked down at his coffee. That's exactly what I did. What happened? Grandpa gave a tired smile. Your father said I worried too much. And Ethan. He explained everything so confidently that I almost believed him. Almost. That word lingered between us. I still wasn't prepared to suspect anyone, but I had begun noticing something else. Every explanation depended on trust. No one ever offered supporting documentation voluntarily. The following week, Grandpa asked whether I would accompany him to Attorney Michael Lawson's office. I need to update a few estate papers. Of course. Michael Lawson had represented Grandpa for nearly 30 years. He wasn't a family friend. He was the kind of attorney who spoke carefully, took detailed notes, and never volunteered opinions. After greeting us warmly, he led Grandpa into his private office. I expected to wait in the reception area. Instead, Grandpa turned around. Stay. Michael looked toward Grandpa. That's entirely your decision. It is, Grandpa nodded. I'd like Magnolia here. For nearly an hour, they discussed ordinary estate matters. Property titles, charitable donations, tax planning, medical directives. Everything sounded routine. Then Grandpa surprised me. If I wanted to leave written instructions that remain confidential until certain conditions are met. Michael adjusted his glasses. That's certainly possible. What kind of conditions? The instructions can specify when they become effective. Grandpa thought for a moment. Could they remain sealed? Yes. And unavailable to everyone, provided they're prepared correctly and filed according to probate procedure. Grandpa looked satisfied. He didn't elaborate. Neither did Michael. I assumed they were discussing some private family letter. Nothing more. As we left the office, I finally asked, planning something. Grandpa smiled. Just being prepared. For what? The future. That answer explained absolutely nothing. Several days later, he invited me back to his apartment. A legal pad sat on the dining table beside a fountain pen. Its first several pages had already been filled with Grandpa's careful handwriting. He immediately covered the pages with another folder. Not yet, I laughed, keeping secrets. A few. He changed the subject so naturally that I stopped asking. Instead, we continued organizing records. By now, I'd built a complete timeline covering nearly 8 years of property expenses. Patterns became easier to recognize. Maintenance costs rose sharply after Ethan's company assumed management. Contractors changed frequently. Several invoices contained rounded numbers instead of exact totals. Again, None of that proved fraud, but together they justified asking questions. Professional questions. Nothing more. The following Friday, my phone rang while I was leaving work. It was Grandpa. "Maggie, you sound tired." "I am. I'll come by. Bring your laptop." When I arrived, he was sitting quietly in his favorite recliner. He pointed toward my spreadsheets. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "You've never once accused anyone. There isn't enough information to accuse anyone." He smiled proudly. "Exactly." He leaned forward. "Do you know why I asked you instead of someone else?" "I assumed because I work with records." "That's part of it? What else?" "You don't start with conclusions." I didn't answer. Because he was right. In my profession, conclusions come last. Evidence comes first. Grandpa slowly reached into a drawer beside his chair. He removed a plain manila envelope. There was nothing written on the front, no address, no label. He placed it on the table, but kept one hand resting firmly over it. "I've started preparing something." I looked at the envelope. "What is it?" "Insurance." I smiled. "I thought that's what lawyers were for." "They are. But sometimes the truth also needs protecting." Before I could ask another question, Grandpa carefully slid the envelope back into the drawer. "I'll explain someday." Then he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. One that wasn't fearful, it was patient. As though he already knew exactly how the story would end. I kept thinking about the envelope. Not because I wanted to know what Grandpa Samuel had written, because it was the first time I'd ever seen him prepare for a future he clearly believed would become complicated. Until then, I had always viewed him as someone who solved problems immediately. If a tenant complained, he called the contractor. If taxes increased, he met with his accountant. If a family member struggled, he offered help. He never postponed difficult conversations. Yet now he was quietly creating something he refused to explain. That alone told me he no longer believed ordinary conversations could solve what was coming. About 3 months later, Grandpa was hospitalized with pneumonia. The doctors were optimistic. At 84, recovery would take time, but they expected him to return home after rehabilitation. When I visited the morning after his admission, the nurse checked the visitor list. "I'm sorry." She looked at her computer. "Immediate family only today." I smiled politely. "I am immediate family." She looked uncomfortable. "I understand." "But someone requested limited visitors." "Who?" "I'm not allowed to discuss that." I thanked her and walked back toward the parking garage. I wasn't angry with the nurse. She was following hospital policy. Still, something felt strange. Grandpa had never restricted my visits before. That evening I called him. His phone went directly to voicemail. The next morning he returned my call. "Maggie." His voice sounded weak. "I came yesterday." "I know. They wouldn't let me in." A pause. "They told me." "You did. Ethan mentioned you stopped by." I frowned. "You didn't ask them to keep me out." "No." Another pause. "I assumed you were busy." "I wasn't." Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, Grandpa said quietly, "Try again tomorrow." The following afternoon I returned. Different nurse, same answer. "I'm sorry. Only approved visitors." "I spoke with my grandfather yesterday." She hesitated. "I really can't discuss the authorization." Again, I thanked her. Again, I left. This time, I didn't simply drive away. I sat inside my car for almost 20 minutes thinking. In my profession, when something unusual happens, once it's probably coincidence. Twice you begin documenting. I opened the notes application on my phone. Date, time, hospital floor, Name printed on the nurse's badge, reason given, nothing dramatic, just facts. 3 days later, I tried again. This time the receptionist recognized me. "I remember you. I was hoping today's different." She checked the computer. "I'm sorry." I nodded. "I understand." As I turned to leave, an elderly volunteer quietly approached me. "Miss Chen?" "Yes. I probably shouldn't say this." She glanced around before lowering her voice. "I've seen you here several times." "I have." "Your grandfather asks whether you visited." I felt my stomach tighten. "He does." She nodded. "They tell him you're working." I stared at her. "He thinks I'm choosing not to come?" "I don't know exactly what's being said." She looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I just thought, if it were my family..." She never finished the sentence. She didn't need to. I thanked her for telling me. Driving home, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, disappointment. Someone wasn't merely limiting my visits. Someone was controlling the story Grandpa heard about me. The next morning, I called Ethan. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Maggie. I've been trying to visit Grandpa." "I know. They keep turning me away." "Yeah." His voice sounded almost casual. "The doctors think fewer visitors are better." I spoke with Grandpa. "So, he didn't know I'd been coming." Silence. Then Ethan laughed softly. "He's confused sometimes." That sentence immediately bothered me. Grandpa occasionally forgot where he left his glasses. He sometimes repeated stories. He was not confused. Certainly not about conversations we'd had the previous day. "I don't think that's accurate." "Maggie." His tone hardened. "Why are you making everything difficult? I'm asking a question. And I'm answering it." "You aren't really." He sighed dramatically. "Look. I'm handling everything. Dad's handling paperwork. Mom's there every day. The last thing Grandpa needs is family arguing." "I'm not arguing." "Then stop treating this like one of your workplace investigations." There it was again. Investigation. As though asking basic questions automatically made me the problem, I ended the call without raising my voice. Later that afternoon, I requested several vacation days from work. Not because I planned to fight with anyone, because I intended to be available whenever Grandpa could finally receive visitors. Instead, I spent much of that week sitting in hospital waiting rooms, reading, working remotely, occasionally speaking with nurses. I never demanded exceptions. I never accused staff of wrongdoing. I simply showed up. By the 4th day, one nurse recognized me immediately. "You've been incredibly patient." "I know everyone has procedures." She smiled. I wish more families understood that. While we talked, another nurse approached carrying paperwork. She looked toward me. "Oh, you're Magnolia." "Yes." She glanced at the chart in her hands. "I've seen your name before." My attention sharpened. "You have..." She nodded. "I thought you were declining visits." I felt every muscle in my shoulders tense. "No." "I've been trying to visit all week." She looked genuinely surprised. She stopped herself. "I'm sorry." Hospital employees are trained to protect patient privacy. She couldn't tell me anything more, but she had already told me enough. Someone had created 2 completely different stories, one inside the hospital, another outside it. Neither matched reality. That evening, I added another page to my growing notes. Dates, conversations, names. Nothing emotional, just a timeline. A week later, Grandpa was transferred to a rehabilitation facility. I hoped things would improve. Instead, the restrictions continued. Sometimes I was told therapy was running late. Sometimes he was sleeping. Sometimes he had visitors already. Once I waited nearly 3 hours before learning he had supposedly been discharged for testing. When I called later, Grandpa answered immediately. "I'm still here." "You are?" "Of course. They told me you left." He became very quiet. "Maggie." "Yes." "Keep writing everything down." My pen stopped moving. "What?" "Every visit. Every phone call. Every date." I slowly sat down in my kitchen chair. "Why?" Another long silence. Then he answered with remarkable clarity. "Because memories can be challenged." He coughed before continuing. "Records are harder." That single sentence sounded exactly like something I might have told one of my own investigators. Not something Grandpa usually said. 2 days later, I finally saw him. His physical therapist happened to wheel him through the rehabilitation lobby just as I arrived. Grandpa looked thinner, older, but when he saw me, his face immediately brightened. "Maggie." Before I could even reach him, Ethan appeared from a hallway. "There you are." He smiled for everyone else to see. "I was just taking Grandpa upstairs. I've only been here a minute. He needs to rest." Grandpa frowned. "I can talk." "Later, Dad." Ethan corrected himself. "I mean Grandpa." The mistake was small, but it caught my attention. He sounded less like a grandson, more like someone accustomed to giving instructions. Grandpa reached into the pocket of his cardigan. His fingers searched for something. Finally, he pulled out his phone. "I almost forgot." He pressed several buttons before handing it to me. "I left you something." Ethan immediately stepped forward. "What are you doing?" Grandpa ignored him. "Take it." I accepted the phone. The screen displayed one unopened voicemail, recorded by Grandpa himself. The timestamp showed it had been created 3 days earlier. I looked up in confusion. "You recorded a message. For me?" Grandpa nodded once. "Listen to it when you're alone." Before I could ask another question, a nurse called his name. The wheelchair rolled away. Ethan followed without looking back. I sat in my car for several minutes before pressing play. Grandpa's voice filled the silence. "Maggie, if you're hearing this, then some of the things I worried about are already happening." He paused to catch his breath. "I don't know how far they'll go. But promise me one thing. Keep every record. Someday, someone besides you will finally need to see them." 3 days later, before I had another chance to visit him, Grandpa Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was scheduled for the following week. And before the obituary was even printed, my family had already begun telling everyone a story about why I had been absent during Grandpa's final months. Grandpa Samuel's funeral took place on a gray October morning, the kind of morning where the sky seemed unwilling to brighten. People from every stage of his life came: former tenants, business partners, neighbors, church friends, retired contractors who had worked with him decades earlier. I stood near the back of the chapel before the service began, quietly greeting people who recognized me. Almost every conversation sounded the same. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandfather talked about you all the time. He was proud of you." Those words should have comforted me. Instead, they left me wondering why my own family acted as though Grandpa and I had barely spoken. When the service ended, people gathered in the fellowship hall. I was pouring coffee when I overheard 2 distant relatives talking. "It's a shame Magnolia wasn't around much toward the end." I heard Grandpa was heartbroken. I froze. The second woman nodded sympathetically. "Linda said Magnolia became too busy with work." I slowly turned around. Neither woman realized I was standing behind them. I smiled politely. "Actually," they both looked startled. "I visited nearly every week." Their expressions immediately changed. "Oh, we didn't know." That's what we were told. I didn't argue. I simply nodded and walked away. It was the first time I understood something that had probably been happening for months. People weren't reaching those conclusions on their own. Someone had been giving them that version of the story. Later that afternoon, I found my mother standing alone outside the reception hall. She looked exhausted. For a moment, I considered letting everything go. Then I asked quietly, "Why are people saying I abandoned Grandpa?" She looked genuinely surprised. "Who's saying that?" "I've heard it several times today." Linda sighed. "You know how people talk." "I'm asking where they heard it." "I'm sure no one meant anything by it." "Mom." She folded her arms. "They saw you less often." "They didn't. I tried to visit. You were busy. I took vacation days. I have records." She looked away. "I'm not discussing this today." Neither was I. Not anymore. Because I realized something important. Every conversation ended exactly the same way. Facts were replaced by feelings. Questions became disrespect. Evidence became unnecessary. I stopped trying to convince people. The following week, attorney Michael Lawson invited every beneficiary to his office for the initial estate meeting. His conference room overlooked downtown Columbus, long walnut table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything about the office reflected quiet professionalism. Michael greeted each of us with the same calm courtesy. No favoritism, no unnecessary conversation. When everyone had arrived, he opened Grandpa Samuel's estate binder. "As you know, Mr. Chen prepared his estate over several years." He reviewed charitable donations first, then several small gifts to longtime employees. Finally, he reached the family distributions. The room grew noticeably quieter. Grandpa had left generous charitable contributions exactly as everyone expected. Several commercial buildings were assigned to family trusts. Investment accounts had designated beneficiaries. Cash distributions were listed. Then Michael looked toward me. "Ms. Chen." I sat a little straighter. "According to the current probate filing," he paused briefly, "you are not receiving any direct estate distribution." No one looked surprised. Except me. Not because of the money. Because Grandpa had spent the previous 2 years repeatedly telling me how important honesty and responsibility were. Nothing about him suggested he would intentionally erase me without explanation. Across the table, Ethan slowly leaned back. "I guess Grandpa made his decision." His tone wasn't cruel. It was satisfied, as though something had finally been confirmed. David avoided looking at me. Linda quietly folded her hands together. No one appeared shocked. That bothered me more than the announcement itself. It felt rehearsed. Michael continued speaking. "The estate documents currently before the court will move through probate according to statutory procedure." Current. That single word caught my attention. He hadn't said final. He hadn't said complete. Only current. When the meeting ended, relatives gradually filtered toward the elevators. Ethan stopped beside me. "I know this isn't easy." I looked at him. "No, it isn't." He lowered his voice. "You should probably just let this go." "What exactly?" "The idea that Grandpa changed his mind?" "I never said he did." "You've always believed there had to be another explanation." I studied his face. He wasn't mocking me. He sounded cautious. Almost as though he expected me to ask something specific. Instead, I asked a different question. "When was Grandpa's estate last updated?" His smile disappeared for a fraction of a second. "You'd have to ask Michael." "I probably will." He shrugged. "Suit yourself." Then he walked away. Most people hear words. My job taught me to notice reactions. That brief hesitation interested me far more than his answer. After everyone left, I returned to Michael Lawson's office. His assistant invited me back inside. Michael removed his glasses. "How can I help you?" "I'd like certified copies of every probate filing available." "Certainly. No objections." He smiled faintly. "Those are public records." "I assumed so." "They are." He printed a request form. I completed it. Neither of us mentioned the inheritance. As I prepared to leave, I asked one final question. "Did Grandpa ever seem uncertain about his estate plans?" Michael answered carefully. "Mr. Chen was one of the most deliberate clients I've ever represented." "I see. He rarely made decisions quickly." That answer somehow reassured me, because it sounded exactly like Grandpa. Deliberate, methodical, never impulsive. 2 days later, I received several hundred pages of probate filings. Most people would have skimmed them. I treated them the same way I reviewed corporate investigations. Chronologically, page by page, reference by reference. The first evening produced nothing unusual. Neither did the second. On the third night, shortly after 11 o'clock, I noticed something odd. One filing listed every estate document submitted to probate. Beside one entry appeared a simple notation: Attachment C filed separately, pursuant to prior court instruction. I flipped through the remaining pages. Attachment C wasn't there. I checked again. Still missing. I reviewed the index. Same notation. Filed separately. I searched every page. Nothing. The next morning, I called the probate clerk. "I'm reviewing case documents." "Yes." "I noticed attachment C isn't included." The clerk typed for several moments. "It wouldn't be." "Why not?" "It isn't available." "Can you explain?" "I'm only able to say it was filed under restricted court instruction." "When does it become available?" "I'm sorry. I can't answer that." She wasn't refusing. She genuinely couldn't. Court restrictions meant exactly that. After hanging up, I stared at my notebook. One missing attachment by itself meant very little. But Grandpa had once told me, the truth also needs protecting. Then I remembered the envelope, the handwritten pages, his meetings with Attorney Lawson, the voicemail, every record, every date, every visit. I suddenly realized something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Grandpa hadn't spent his final years preparing me to argue with the family. He had spent them teaching me to recognize when information was intentionally incomplete. That afternoon, I drove back to Attorney Lawson's office without an appointment. His assistant managed to squeeze me into his schedule for 10 minutes. I placed the probate index on his desk. "I have one question." He glanced at the page. "I suspected you might." I pointed at the notation. "Attachment C." He looked at me for several seconds before answering. "I cannot discuss it, because it's confidential, because I am legally prohibited from discussing it." "Until when?" "I'm prohibited from answering that as well." I nodded slowly. "You knew I'd eventually notice." "I believed you might." He stood signaling the meeting was ending. As I reached the door, he spoke one final sentence. Not loudly, not dramatically. "Ms. Chen?" I turned. "I strongly recommend that you attend every future probate hearing." Everyone, yes. No exceptions. "Is something going to happen?" His expression never changed. "I cannot answer that." I walked out of his office with more questions than answers. 3 weeks later, an official notice from the Franklin County Probate Court arrived in my mailbox. Notice of final hearing. I read it twice, then a third time. Everything suggested the estate was nearly complete. Except for one detail, printed near the bottom in language that seemed almost routine, was a sentence I couldn't stop thinking about. All interested beneficiaries are required to appear in person. I had no idea that one sentence would bring every member of my family into the same courtroom and place Grandpa Samuel's sealed envelope in front of a judge. 3 weeks later, I walked into the Franklin County Probate Court carrying nothing more than a legal pad, a pen, and a folder containing my notes. Not because I expected to use them, because showing up prepared had become a habit. The hallway outside courtroom 4B was already crowded. Families whispered to one another. Attorneys reviewed files. Court staff moved briskly between offices. Everything felt ordinary. Until I saw my family. Ethan noticed me first. He leaned toward my parents, said something under his breath, and all three turned in my direction. None of them smiled. None of them acknowledged me. Instead, they resumed their conversation as though I had walked past them on a public sidewalk. For a brief moment, I considered leaving, not because I was intimidated, because I suddenly understood how exhausting it had become to stand in rooms where people had decided I no longer existed. Then I remembered Grandpa's voice. "Keep every record." I checked in with the courtroom clerk and quietly took a seat near the back. A few minutes later, Attorney Michael Lawson entered carrying 2 leather folders. One was the estate file I had seen before. The other was noticeably smaller. Dark blue, no markings. He held it himself instead of handing it to an assistant. That immediately caught my attention. Court proceedings began precisely at 9 o'clock. The judge reviewed several procedural matters involving unrelated estates before our case was called. Estate of Samuel Chen. Everyone stood. Michael approached one table. David and Ethan sat beside their attorney. I remained alone at another. The judge reviewed several routine filings, asset distributions, tax certifications, receipts. Everything proceeded exactly the way probate hearings usually do. After nearly 20 minutes, the judge looked toward Attorney Lawson. "Counsel, is there anything further before the court closes administration?" Michael remained standing. "Yes, Your Honor." He reached into the blue folder. "There is one remaining matter Mr. Samuel Chen instructed me to present." David immediately frowned. "What matter?" Michael ignored the interruption. "Several years before his passing, Mr. Chen executed additional written instructions." The judge looked down at the case file. "I don't see those among today's submissions. They were filed separately under court seal pursuant to the decedent's written request." The room became unusually quiet. The judge flipped through several pages. "I do see reference to restricted material." She looked back towards Michael. "Has every interested beneficiary appeared today?" "Yes, Your Honor." She looked around the courtroom. "Court clerk." The clerk checked attendance. "Yes, Judge." "All required parties are present." The judge nodded once. "Very well." David suddenly stood. "Your Honor, before we proceed, you'll have an opportunity. This is highly irregular." Michael finally spoke. "It is uncommon, but not irregular. The filing was accepted by this court over 2 years before Mr. Chen's death." The judge examined another document. "I have the filing receipt." She read silently for several moments, then looked directly at David. "The court accepted these instructions years ago." David cleared his throat. "We were never informed," Michael answered calmly. "That was Mr. Chen's explicit instruction." Ethan leaned toward his attorney. The two exchanged several hurried whispers. For the first time since Grandpa died, Ethan no longer looked confident. He looked concerned, not frightened. Concerned enough to begin calculating. The judge folded her hands. "Mr. Lawson, please explain exactly what remains before the court." Michael nodded. "Mr. Chen deposited one sealed envelope with this court. He instructed that it remain unopened until 3 conditions were satisfied." The courtroom became completely silent. Michael continued. "First, his death. Second, the completion of primary probate administration. And third, the physical presence of every interested beneficiary in open court. The judge looked toward the clerk. Have all three conditions now been satisfied? Yes, Your Honor. David stood again. I object. The judge raised an eyebrow. On what legal basis? This document has never been disclosed. Michael answered before David's attorney could. Respectfully, that was the purpose of filing it under seal. David's attorney finally stood. Your Honor, we request an opportunity to review the contents before admission. Michael shook his head slightly. That would directly violate Mr. Chen's written instructions. The judge reviewed the probate file once more. Several long seconds passed. Finally, she spoke. The court finds the filing procedurally valid. She paused. The decedent followed the statutory process. The court will honor his instructions. I looked toward my parents. My mother's hands were tightly clasped together. She wasn't crying. She looked uneasy. David stared straight ahead without blinking. Only Ethan kept glancing toward the blue folder, almost as though he already knew what might be inside. That realization unsettled me. How could he fear something he claimed not to know existed? The judge addressed Michael again. Do you have the sealed materials? I do. He carefully opened the blue folder. Inside lay a large, cream-colored envelope. Time had slightly darkened the paper. Across the front, written in Grandpa Samuel's unmistakable handwriting, were 12 words. To be opened only in open court after every beneficiary is present. Nothing else. No dramatic warnings. No accusations. Just instructions. Michael handed the envelope to the courtroom clerk. The clerk examined the seals. They appear intact. The judge inspected the signatures crossing the back flap. Any indication this envelope has previously been opened? No, Your Honor. Michael submitted another document. The notarization completed on the same day as filing. The judge reviewed it carefully. Everything matched. Dates, signatures, case numbers, chain of custody, years of preparation reduced to a few quiet pages of procedural verification. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even spectators waiting for other cases seemed to sense something unusual was happening. The judge looked toward both legal teams. Any remaining objections? David's attorney slowly sat down. No, Your Honor. She nodded once. The objection is noted and overruled. Then she turned toward the clerk. You may open the envelope. The clerk carefully broke the aging wax seal. The sound was barely audible. Yet inside that silent courtroom it seemed impossibly loud. She removed several folded pages, then stopped. There appears to be more than correspondence. Michael nodded. Yes, there should be. The clerk unfolded the first page. Attached behind it were several additional documents secured with an old brass fastener. The judge accepted the packet. She silently reviewed the opening paragraphs herself before looking back toward Michael. Mr. Lawson, did you know the contents? I knew only what Mr. Chen instructed me to know. No more. No, Your Honor. She read another page. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not shock, recognition, as though something she had expected to be simple had suddenly become considerably more significant. She looked across the courtroom. The record will reflect that the sealed submission contains both a personal statement. She paused. And legally operative instructions contingent upon today's proceedings. A murmur spread through the gallery. David closed his eyes. Ethan slowly lowered his head into his hands. My heart began beating faster. Not because I expected money, not because I expected revenge, because for the first time since Grandpa died, I realized he had never intended that envelope to explain the past. He intended it to change what happened next. The judge adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Lawson, please read Mr. Chen's opening statement into the record." Michael accepted the first handwritten page. He looked at Grandpa's familiar handwriting for a long moment before beginning. The very first sentence made every person in that courtroom stop breathing. "If this envelope is being opened today, then everything I feared for my family has already happened." No one moved. Not the judge, not the attorneys, not even the spectators waiting for unrelated probate hearings. Attorney Michael Lawson adjusted the handwritten pages only once before continuing. His voice remained steady, measured, exactly the way Grandpa Samuel would have wanted. "If this envelope is being opened today, then everything I feared for my family has already happened." He paused only long enough for the court reporter to finish typing. Then he continued reading. "I did not prepare these instructions because I expected my family to become criminals." Across the courtroom, Ethan slowly lifted his head. "I prepared them because I watched good people slowly convince themselves that protecting one another mattered more than protecting the truth." No one interrupted. The words weren't dramatic. They were painfully precise. Grandpa wasn't accusing anyone of evil. He was describing a pattern I had watched develop for years without fully understanding it. Michael turned the page. "If you are hearing this, Magnolia, then I was right about one thing." My throat tightened. It was the first time Grandpa had spoken directly to me since his death. "You would still be there." I looked down at my hands. Somehow that sentence hurt more than anything else. Not because Grandpa believed in me, because he had expected everyone else to leave. Michael continued, "I have spent years observing how each member of my family behaves when money, reputation, and loyalty begin pulling in different directions." The judge listened without expression. David stared at the table. Linda quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Ethan never looked toward me. Grandpa's letter wasn't emotional. It read almost like a journal kept by someone patiently collecting observations. "My granddaughter Magnolia never asked me for financial help. She never requested ownership of my buildings. She never asked about inheritance. She only asked questions whenever numbers stopped making sense." Michael paused again. The courtroom remained silent. Grandpa had written every sentence by hand. The paper showed slight variations in ink pressure where his hand had undoubtedly become tired. Those imperfections somehow made the words feel even more personal. "Questions made certain members of my family uncomfortable. Not because questions are disrespectful, because questions require answers." I glanced toward Ethan. His jaw tightened. David still refused to look up. Michael turned another page. I intentionally remained silent during many conversations. That sentence surprised me. Grandpa had always seemed passive whenever disagreements occurred. Now I understood why. He hadn't been ignoring them. He had been watching. People reveal their true priorities over time. Rarely during arguments. Almost always during ordinary days when they believe no one is paying attention. I remembered dozens of family dinners, birthday parties, holiday meals, conversations that had seemed meaningless. Grandpa had apparently been studying all of them, not suspiciously, patiently. Michael continued. When Magnolia questioned maintenance expenses, she was told to stop creating conflict. I immediately remembered that Sunday dinner. Dad folding his napkin, Mom telling me to keep peace. Ethan insisting I was investigating everything. Grandpa remembered it too. When she quietly accepted being excluded from family gatherings, I waited. Another page. When people began telling me Magnolia was too busy to visit, my chest tightened. The courtroom suddenly felt much smaller. I also waited. David finally closed his eyes. Very slowly, as though he already knew what came next. Michael read Grandpa's next paragraph. I never believed Magnolia abandoned me. Because she always called. She always left messages. She always tried again. A tear rolled down my cheek before I even noticed it. Grandpa had known. All those hospital visits, every rejection, every voicemail. He had known. Michael continued. I also knew others believed I would eventually become too confused to notice inconsistencies. That sentence immediately changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. Until then, everyone had assumed Grandpa's letter was personal. Now it was becoming something much more significant. The judge leaned slightly forward. Michael read carefully. I was never confused. Another pause. I simply chose not to confront people before I understood the full picture. I almost smiled. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. He had taught me to observe before concluding. Apparently, he had lived by the same principle himself. Michael reached the next page. I respectfully request that the following documents already entrusted to attorney Michael Lawson be admitted into evidence if this letter is opened. He handed another packet to the bailiff. The documents were distributed first to the judge, then to both legal teams. Finally, I received my own copy. Across the top appeared Grandpa's handwriting. Personal timeline of property management observations. I flipped through the pages. Each entry contained a date, a location, a short description. Nothing emotional, no accusations, only observations. March 14th. Roof repairs invoiced. No contractor vehicles observed. July 8th. Tenant reported unresolved plumbing despite completed invoice. November 3rd. Rental deposit arrived 6 days later than bank records indicated. December 19th. Magnolia questioned expense totals during family dinner. Family discouraged further discussion. I stared at that final line. Grandpa had written it. He hadn't forgotten that evening. He had documented it. Every page looked remarkably familiar because it resembled exactly the kind of timeline I created during workplace investigations, years before I ever built my own spreadsheets. Grandpa had quietly started building his. Michael resumed reading. These notes do not prove wrongdoing. The judge nodded slightly, an important clarification. Grandpa continued. They prove only that questions existed. Another sentence followed. Questions deserve honest answers. Not silence, not guilt, not anger. Answers. Michael turned to the final handwritten page. If the court determines these questions remain unresolved, he looked toward the judge before continuing. I request that an independent forensic accounting be conducted. The courtroom became completely still again. Grandpa had not asked the judge to believe him. He had not asked anyone to punish my family. He had asked for something far simpler. Verification, evidence, facts. Exactly the approach I had taken throughout my entire career. The judge carefully reviewed the attached legal instruction. After several moments, she looked toward Attorney Lawson. Mr. Lawson. Yes, Your Honor. Were these additional documents filed contemporaneously with the sealed envelope? They were, and remained under the same court seal. Yes. She examined the notarization. Everything matched. Every signature, every date, every filing number. David's attorney finally stood. Your Honor, we object to any implication that these handwritten observations constitute evidence of financial misconduct. The judge nodded. I agree. She looked toward everyone present. The court does not consider personal observations alone sufficient proof. For one brief moment, Ethan looked relieved. Then the judge continued. However, she lifted Grandpa's final instruction. The decedent is not asking the court to reach a conclusion. He is requesting an independent forensic accounting. She paused. That request is procedurally supported by the contingent instructions properly filed with this court. David leaned toward his attorney. The two whispered urgently. Across the room, Linda quietly cried into a tissue. No one looked toward me anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't the person being questioned. The documents were. The judge placed Grandpa's handwritten timeline beside the official probate file. Then she spoke the sentence that permanently changed the direction of the case. The court grants the request. She looked directly at Attorney Lawson. I am appointing an independent forensic accountant to review the estate administration property management records and related financial transactions. She signed the order. The sound of her pen scratching across the paper seemed impossibly loud. Grandpa's envelope had accomplished exactly what he intended. Not revenge, not punishment, transparency. As the bailiff collected the signed order, Ethan finally looked across the courtroom toward me. For years, he had smiled every time someone called me suspicious, paranoid, difficult. Now, for the first time, he wasn't looking at me with confidence. He was looking at the judge's signature, because from that moment forward, the numbers would finally be allowed to speak for themselves. When people hear the words forensic accounting, they often imagine detectives carrying boxes of evidence out of buildings or uncovering millions of dollars hidden in offshore accounts. Real life is far less dramatic. A forensic accountant doesn't begin with accusations. They begin with records. Every invoice, every deposit, every contract, every canceled check, every tax filing, every approval, every email authorizing a payment. Then they ask one simple question. Do all of these documents tell the same story? If they don't, someone has to explain why. The court appointed an independent accounting firm from Cleveland that had never worked with Grandpa Samuel, my family, or Attorney Lawson. That detail mattered. No prior relationships, no conflicts of interest. Just professionals following evidence wherever it led. The review took nearly 4 months. Life outside the courtroom continued. I went to work every morning, reviewed compliance cases, interviewed employees, prepared reports. Most of my coworkers had no idea I spent many evenings answering requests from accountants reviewing my grandfather's estate. They occasionally asked whether everything was all right. I always answered honestly. I'm waiting. Waiting became surprisingly difficult. Not because I feared what the accountants might find, because my family suddenly became unusually quiet. For years, I had been the difficult one, the suspicious one, the daughter who supposedly couldn't let anything go. Now no one called. No one criticized me. No one accused me of tearing the family apart. Silence replaced confrontation. I couldn't decide whether that was progress or strategy. About 6 weeks into the review, one of the accountants requested a meeting. His name was Robert Ellis. Gray hair, soft-spoken, the kind of professional who never exaggerated anything. Attorney Lawson attended. So did I. Robert placed several binders on the conference table. We're not prepared to issue conclusions. I understand. But I'd like clarification regarding several documents. He slid one invoice toward me. Have you seen this before? I looked at it carefully. It was from Ethan's property management company. Commercial roof replacement, $38,000. One of Grandpa's warehouse buildings. The date immediately caught my attention. I remember organizing this. Robert nodded. What stands out? The roof wasn't replaced. He looked interested. How do you know? I visited the property several weeks after this invoice. The old roof was still there. Robert wrote something in his notebook. We independently confirmed the roof replacement occurred 8 months later. I stared at the invoice. So this bill, we're still determining exactly what happened. No conclusions, just facts. Exactly as it should be. He opened another binder. This maintenance invoice. Snow removal, landscaping, tree trimming, same date, mid-January. I almost smiled. Ohio was buried under snow that week. Robert nodded again. We noticed. He wasn't trying to impress me. He simply appreciated that someone else had noticed inconsistencies years earlier. Over the following hour, similar examples accumulated. Invoices submitted before work occurred, maintenance billed twice, vendor payments with incomplete documentation, properties reporting emergency repairs despite no insurance claims. None of those records automatically proved intentional misconduct. Accounting mistakes happen. Poor record keeping happens. Miscommunication happens. But eventually, patterns become too consistent to dismiss as coincidence. Robert closed one binder. There's something else. He placed another document in front of me, bank transfer records. I recognized Grandpa's primary operating account immediately. Several large payments had been made to Ethan's company. That wasn't surprising. The descriptions were property management adjustment, emergency operating advance, special reimbursement, no supporting documentation, no attached approvals, just transfers. Robert explained carefully. We requested supporting records. Were they provided? Some were, and the others, they apparently don't exist. I leaned back quietly. Again, no conclusions. Only missing records. A week later, the court scheduled another evidentiary hearing. The accounting review wasn't finished, but enough preliminary findings existed to update the judge. When I entered the courtroom, Ethan looked noticeably different. He had lost weight. The confidence that once defined him had faded. He still dressed impeccably, still smiled politely, but his smile no longer reached his eyes. The hearing lasted nearly 3 hours. Robert explained his methodology first, where records originated, how transactions were verified, which independent sources had confirmed dates. Only then did he discuss findings. No dramatic language, no accusations, just comparisons. This invoice indicates roof replacement on March 18th. He displayed photographs. The roof visible on April 6th is unchanged. Another document. This landscaping invoice was issued during severe winter weather. Weather reports entered into evidence confirmed heavy snowfall. Another. This payment references emergency plumbing. Tenant maintenance logs showed no corresponding service requests. The judge asked thoughtful questions throughout. Nothing was rushed. David's attorney challenged several conclusions. Robert answered each question calmly. If additional records exist, we are happy to review them. Professional, neutral, objective. Exactly the kind of witness judges trust. Then came the document that changed everything. Robert displayed a spreadsheet summarizing maintenance expenses over 8 years. The graph itself wasn't remarkable. The timing was. Costs increased dramatically almost immediately after Ethan's company assumed management responsibilities. Occupancy remained stable. Rental income remained relatively stable. Insurance claims remained relatively stable. Only maintenance spending climbed sharply. David's attorney immediately stood. Correlation doesn't establish misconduct. Robert nodded. Correct. It does not. Which is why we continued examining supporting documentation. He produced another binder. Inside were contractor interviews. Several contractors confirmed performing work. Others confirmed that they had submitted estimates, but never received contracts. One company had never even worked on Grandpa's buildings despite invoices listing its name. That caught everyone's attention. The judge leaned forward. Explain. Robert answered carefully. We contacted every contractor appearing repeatedly within the records. One business informed us they never performed the services reflected in these invoices. The courtroom became completely silent. Ethan slowly rubbed his forehead. David stopped taking notes. Linda stared at the table. I wasn't watching them anymore. I was watching the documents. Years earlier, I had noticed small inconsistencies. Grandpa had noticed patterns. Now, independent professionals had connected those same pieces without ever speaking to either of us first. That mattered enormously, because truth shouldn't depend on who tells it. It should survive independent verification. Robert wasn't finished. He requested permission to display one final exhibit. The judge agreed. The projector illuminated 2 timelines side by side. The first timeline contained financial transactions. The second contained records I had created years earlier while helping Grandpa organize his files. I blinked. Those were my spreadsheets. Robert looked toward me briefly before addressing the court. Ms. Chen's personal timelines were provided to us after our preliminary review. He paused. We intentionally withheld them until completing our independent analysis. The judge nodded. So they did not influence your conclusions? Correct. We reached our findings first. And afterward, Robert displayed both timelines together. They matched with remarkable consistency. My handwritten notes documenting building visits, Grandpa's observations, bank records, contractor schedules, maintenance invoices, everything aligned. Not perfectly, but closely enough to corroborate one another. For years, my family had dismissed me as someone who asked too many questions. Now an independent accounting firm was essentially saying the same thing Grandpa once had. The questions had been reasonable. The judge slowly removed her glasses. The court appreciates the thoroughness of this review. She looked across the courtroom. These findings raise concerns extending beyond ordinary probate administration. David's attorney stood once more. Your Honor, we respectfully request additional time. The judge nodded. You'll have that opportunity. She signed several procedural orders before continuing. The court will issue a final ruling after reviewing the complete accounting report. As everyone gathered their documents, I expected Ethan to leave immediately. Instead, he approached my table. For the first time in years, there was no arrogance in his voice, only exhaustion. I never thought it would get this far. I looked at him quietly. It didn't have to. He nodded slowly. I know. Then he walked away. I watched him disappear through the courtroom doors, wondering whether he finally understood something Grandpa had recognized long before any of us did. Small compromises rarely stay small. Eventually, they become patterns, and patterns have a way of surviving even after memories begin to fade. The final hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday morning in early June. Nearly 11 months had passed since Grandpa Samuel's funeral. 11 months of document requests, independent reviews, legal briefs, supplemental filings, and more waiting than I thought any family could endure. By the time I arrived at the courthouse, I no longer wondered whether I would receive part of Grandpa's estate. That question had stopped mattering months earlier. The only thing I wanted was for the official record to reflect what had actually happened. Nothing more, nothing less. When I entered the courtroom, the atmosphere felt completely different from the first hearing. There were no confident smiles, no whispered conversations, no assumptions that everything had already been decided. Everyone understood that this hearing would close the case. Judge Catherine Brooks entered promptly at 9. After reviewing several procedural matters, she turned to our case. The court has reviewed the complete forensic accounting report, the supplemental evidence, the testimony presented during prior hearings, and the parties' written responses. She paused. The court is prepared to issue its findings. Every chair seemed to become perfectly still. The judge began by explaining something I appreciated. She did not immediately discuss money. She first explained fiduciary responsibility. When an individual manages another person's financial affairs, that responsibility requires more than good intentions. It requires accurate records, transparent accounting, and the ability to explain financial decisions with supporting documentation. She looked toward everyone equally. This standard protects families as much as it protects assets. I saw several people in the gallery nod. The judge continued. The court does not conclude that every questioned transaction constituted intentional fraud. That sentence visibly relaxed David. Only for a moment. She continued reading. However, the court does find repeated failures to maintain adequate documentation, repeated approval of unsupported reimbursements, repeated overpayments, unsupported by contemporaneous records, and repeated management practices inconsistent with fiduciary obligations. David slowly lowered his head. Ethan closed his eyes. The judge wasn't calling either man a criminal. She was saying something equally important. They had failed in responsibilities they voluntarily accepted. And because of that failure, the estate could not simply pretend everything had been handled correctly. Judge Brooks turned another page. The court further finds that Mr. Samuel Chen anticipated these concerns years before his death. She lifted Grandpa's handwritten letter. His contingent instructions requesting independent verification were reasonable under the circumstances. For the first time in the entire proceeding, she looked directly at me. Miss Chen? I stood. The court wishes to acknowledge your cooperation throughout these proceedings. You consistently preserved records. You complied with every request. You sought independent review rather than personal accusation. I simply nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. She returned to the written ruling. As a result, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The court orders revised accounting of the estate. Several pages followed outlining technical procedures. Improper management reimbursements would be recalculated. Unsupported distributions would be returned to the estate. Property values would be adjusted using corrected financial records. Then came the ruling no one expected. The court further determines that Mr. Samuel Chen's final distribution instructions shall be administered using the corrected accounting established through these proceedings. Attorney Lawson quietly smiled. Not triumphantly. Professionally. The judge continued. Accordingly. She listed revised beneficiary distributions. Several charitable gifts remained unchanged. Longtime employees still received exactly what Grandpa intended. Then she reached my name. Magnolia Chen shall receive the commercial office building located on East Broad Street, together with its associated operating reserve account, consistent with Mr. Samuel Chen's contingent instructions. I didn't react immediately, not because I wasn't surprised, because I suddenly understood why Grandpa had chosen that building. It wasn't his most valuable property. It was the first commercial building he had ever purchased. The one he often called the building that started everything. He hadn't left me the largest asset. He had left me the one carrying the greatest personal meaning. Judge Brooks finished reading the order. The revised estate distributions shall become effective upon completion of the corrected accounting. She signed the final judgment. Years of uncertainty ended with the movement of one pen. The hearing officially concluded. People slowly gathered their belongings. No reporters waited outside. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. Real life rarely ends that way. I placed my notebook inside my briefcase. Before I could leave, someone quietly called my name. Magnolia. It was my mother. Linda stood several feet away. For the first time in years, she looked uncertain. Can we talk? I looked at her. Of course. We stepped into a quiet hallway outside the courtroom. She clasped her hands together exactly the way she always had when she was nervous. I never wanted this. I believed her, at least partly. I know. I thought. She searched for words. I thought keeping everyone together was more important than arguing over documents. I nodded slowly. I know. I didn't realize, her voice cracked, how much that cost you. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, I'm sorry. It was the apology I had imagined hearing for years. Yet when it finally arrived, it didn't repair anything. Not because it wasn't sincere, because apologies cannot return birthdays, they cannot recreate holidays, they cannot erase years of being told that asking honest questions makes you disloyal. I smiled gently. I appreciate you saying that. Tears filled her eyes. Can we be a family again? I answered as honestly as I could. I don't know. She looked down. I've forgiven you. Her eyes lifted slightly. But forgiveness isn't the same as trust. She nodded once. Slowly, painfully. I understand. And for the first time, I believed she actually did. As I walked toward the courthouse exit, Ethan caught up with me. He looked exhausted, older than he had a year earlier. I owe you an apology too. I waited. I kept telling myself I was protecting Grandpa's business. He gave a bitter laugh. Eventually, I realized I was mostly protecting myself. I didn't interrupt. I never meant for everyone to push you out, but I also never stopped them. That sentence sounded painfully honest. I know. I don't expect you to forgive me. I already have. He looked surprised. But I'm not going back to the way things were. He nodded immediately. You shouldn't. There was no argument, no attempt to negotiate, no promises that everything would be different. Only acceptance. Sometimes accountability begins when excuses finally stop. As I reached the courthouse doors, Attorney Michael Lawson called after me. Miss Chen. I turned. He held a small flat package wrapped in brown paper. I nearly forgot. He smiled softly. Mr. Chen left very specific instructions. I accepted the package. It's addressed to you. When was I supposed to receive it? Only after every court proceeding had concluded. I looked down at Grandpa's familiar handwriting. For Magnolia, after everything is finished. I looked back at Michael. Is this part of the estate? He shook his head. No. It's personal. I slipped the package carefully into my briefcase. For months, Grandpa's sealed envelope had changed my understanding of my family. Now somehow, he still had one final message waiting for me. I didn't open Grandpa Samuel's package in the courthouse parking lot. For a moment I was tempted. After nearly a year of hearings, documents and waiting curiosity pulled at me harder than ever. But Grandpa had spent his entire life teaching me that important things deserve the right setting, so I drove home. The rain had finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds just enough to illuminate the small maple tree in front of my townhouse. It was the same tree Grandpa had helped me plant after I bought my first home. He had stood beside me that afternoon with a shovel in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Trees are funny, he'd said. You spend years wondering if anything's happening. Then one day, you realize they've been growing the whole time. I smiled at the memory before unlocking my front door. Inside the house felt unusually quiet, not lonely, peaceful. I placed the brown paper package on my kitchen table and carefully untied the cotton string instead of tearing it. Inside was a leather journal. Its cover showed years of use. Beneath it rested a single envelope with my name written across the front in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. I took a deep breath before opening it. The first sentence immediately blurred through my tears. My dear Magnolia, if you're reading this, then you stayed exactly the person I hoped you would become. I wiped my eyes and continued. I know the court has probably answered many questions, but there are a few answers only I can give. I leaned back in my chair. Outside, rainwater still dripped from the trees. The entire world seemed quieter as Grandpa's voice came alive through his handwriting. I never wanted my estate to become a test. I wanted my family to remain a family. But after watching everyone for several years, I realized something difficult. Money wasn't dividing us. Fear was. I stopped reading for a moment. Fear, not greed, not hatred. Fear. Grandpa explained what he meant. Your father feared public embarrassment. Your mother feared conflict. Ethan feared failure. Rebecca feared family scandal. Each of them believed avoiding uncomfortable truth would somehow protect everyone. Instead, it slowly replaced honesty with silence. I had never thought about it that way. Throughout the court case, I had viewed every decision through the lens of accountability. Grandpa viewed them through humanity. He wasn't excusing anyone. He was explaining how ordinary people slowly made extraordinary mistakes. I continued reading. You were different. Not because you were smarter, not because you were stronger. You simply refused to ignore facts once you saw them. You also refused to accuse people before you had evidence. That balance is rare. I quietly laughed through another tear. Grandpa always appreciated precision, even in compliments. The next page surprised me. I did not leave you the East Broad Street building because it earns the highest income. I left it to you because it was the first building I ever purchased. I was younger than you are now. I had no idea what I was doing. I made mistakes. I learned. I kept going. I hope it reminds you that every lasting legacy begins with something ordinary. I looked out the kitchen window. For months I had assumed Grandpa's greatest gift had been restoring my place in the estate. Now I understood. The building wasn't about wealth. It represented beginning again. The final pages contained something I hadn't expected. A handwritten list titled, Things I Hope You Never Forget. The list wasn't about business, or law, or inheritance. It contained simple observations collected across an entire lifetime. The truth usually whispers before it shouts. Patience is not weakness. Documentation protects honest people. Someone who demands blind loyalty is usually afraid of transparency. Never confuse peace with silence. Forgiveness frees your heart. Trust must earn its way back. I closed the journal for several minutes. Those 6 sentences somehow summarized everything the previous year had taught me. Over the following months, life gradually became normal again. The East Broad Street office building remained occupied by small local businesses, a physical therapy clinic, an accounting office, a nonprofit serving military families. I hired an independent property management company selected through a competitive review process. Every contract required transparent reporting. Every invoice required supporting documentation. Not because I distrusted people, because clear systems protect everyone involved. Attorney Lawson smiled during our first quarterly review. Your grandfather would approve. I hope so. I think he already anticipated this. He handed me one final document. Grandpa had established a modest educational fund years earlier. Its purpose had never been activated. He had left the final decision to me. After several weeks of thought, I expanded it. The Samuel Chen Ethics and Integrity Scholarship began awarding annual scholarships to first-generation college students pursuing accounting, auditing, compliance, public administration, and law. The selection committee included professors, retired judges, and ethics officers. No member of my family served on it. That wasn't punishment. It was simply appropriate governance. The first scholarship ceremony took place almost exactly 1 year after the court's final ruling. Standing at the podium, I looked at 20 young students whose futures were just beginning. I told them something Grandpa once told me. Questions aren't disrespectful. They're how responsible people learn. Several students smiled. Others wrote the sentence in their notebooks. I hoped they would someday understand why it mattered. My relationship with my family settled into something new. We weren't enemies, but we also weren't pretending the past never happened. Linda occasionally sent birthday cards, sometimes holiday cookies. I thanked her every time. David wrote me a short letter several months after the case ended. He admitted he had spent too many years protecting appearances instead of asking difficult questions. He never asked for forgiveness. He simply accepted responsibility. Oddly enough, that honesty meant more than any apology could have. Ethan eventually sold his property management company. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard he accepted a position managing operations for another real estate firm where independent oversight existed. I genuinely hoped he succeeded. Just somewhere accountability was built into the system. People occasionally ask whether I felt victorious after the court ruled in my favor. The honest answer is no. Victory implies someone wins. Families like ours don't really produce winners. They produce people who must decide what kind of future they'll build after the truth finally becomes visible. The court restored Grandpa's wishes. The evidence restored my credibility. But healing happened much more quietly. It happened the first time I stopped wondering whether I had been wrong for asking questions. It happened the day I realized boundaries weren't walls built out of anger. They were doors that I now had the right to open carefully or leave closed. Grandpa's envelope didn't erase the years I lost. Nothing could. But it accomplished something just as important. It made sure no one, not even the people closest to me, could rewrite the truth after he was gone. And in the end, that truth became the inheritance I valued most. The hardest betrayal is often the one that comes wrapped in the language of family. People may tell you that asking questions means you are disloyal, that keeping records means you don't trust the people you love, or that protecting your own boundaries somehow makes you selfish. But healthy families are not afraid of honesty. They don't require silence to survive. If you've ever been excluded, manipulated, or made to feel guilty simply because you wanted the truth, I hope Magnolia's journey reminds you that there is a difference between revenge and justice. Revenge seeks to hurt people. Justice seeks to let facts speak for themselves. And forgiveness, when it comes, does not require giving someone unlimited access to your life again. Healthy boundaries are not punishment. They are a form of self-respect. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from and whether you've ever experienced a situation where telling the truth came at a personal cost. Your perspective may encourage someone else who is facing something similar. If you enjoy thoughtful stories about family resilience, accountability, and healing, consider subscribing so we can continue sharing these journeys together. This is a fictional story created for entertainment, education, and reflection.